So after spending so much time working on videos discussing 14, I started getting burnt out on the topic. Said burning is a bit more literal if you consider my static is currently progging P3S. In order to give myself a healthy break, I decided to revisit Ocarina of Time. I'm sure anyone who has even a hint of familiarity with the game has heard it's either a masterpiece or a dated relic of its time. And a question I've seen pop up in the past couple of years is if the game is even worth playing in an age where Breath of the Wild exists. So why even talk about Ocarina of Time, a game that has arguably been discussed to death? Well, instead of trying to justify why this game is the greatest or horribly dated, I'd rather discuss how we can learn from the ideas presented. The first thing I want to discuss is Ocarina of Time's central theme and how it's conveyed throughout the game. Said central theme is how time changes everything, from our perspective to our relationships, which is rather somber for Nintendo. While the game doesn't fully explore this idea in an interesting or nuanced way, it does have a solid foundation. But before getting into the sobering reality of adulthood, this game chooses to start with the wonder of childhood. And fittingly, Link starts his adventure in the Hyrule equivalent of Neverland. And yes, the graphics have really aged, but the aesthetic and visual design for conveying a bright magical forest still shines through. None of the assets go to waste in conveying the Kokiri Forest as a place for children. We've got tree houses, ramps, a secret passage, and a training ground for would-be warriors, but in that make-believe way. Honestly, I kind of wish more modern games took this diorama approach to creating towns and zones. Sure, it ends up feeling a bit smaller, but at the same time there's intentionality behind every asset placed, which adds a level of craftsmanship. It also makes the area feel more memorable in my opinion because distinct landmarks are even more important with this type of environment design. And before I continue, I just want to mention how briskly paced this game is. It only takes about 3 minutes from the first cutscene to Navi flying into Link's house for you to start playing, which is pretty fast. The bare minimum storytelling of Zelda games actually works to Ocarina of Time's advantage for replayability here. As a whole, the Kokiri Forest is very in line with Nintendo's typical branding for their games, being very colorful and fun-focused. This also makes starting the first dungeon all the more jarring. Inside the Great Deku Tree, it's dark, unfamiliar, and the music changes from playful to encouraging wariness of potential danger. I remember this dungeon actually creeping me out when I was 9 or 10. Now for this dungeon, I'm going to jump topics to discuss something that hasn't aged poorly, and that is the fundamental game design. What I mean by this is that every dungeon consistently follows this gameplay loop. 1. Present an obstacle the player can't yet pass. 2. Grant a new tool to the player after completing certain tasks. 3. Give the player a mandatory task that gives context on how to use the tool. 4. The player will use the tool to pass the previously impassable obstacles. 5. Said tool will be used to handle additional obstacles in varying ways. 6. There will be a final challenge to test the player's mastery of the tool. This is a simple yet effective structure for keeping a player engaged that Nintendo has honed for decades. Not every game conforms to this structure, but many at least borrow from it. Part of this is because it creates a paradigm that teaches the rules to the player without having to break the flow of gameplay. A case of play don't tell, if you will. Zelda games in particular are great for demonstrating this concept as every dungeon is split into delineated chunks. Do keep in mind that this structure is not a concrete requirement for a game to be well designed. Like many aspects of game design, things are often subjective and based on the needs and goals for the game in question. This gameplay loop, however, lends itself well to the action-adventure and RPG genre since they both have a focus on steadily gaining power. Right from the first dungeon, we can already see this gameplay loop in action. Going up the ladder and past some gaps, we come across some climbable vines. The catch, however, is that there are some enemies that will knock you off when trying to climb past them. This acts as a form of gating, which is a way of confining the player to an area until they have completed a certain objective. The reason level designers use this is to subtly prod the player into exploring until they can find what is needed to progress. In this case, the Skulltulas function as region gating, which is primarily used to help stagger out progression over time. It also helps ensure the mental load the player is carrying won't become overwhelming while also rewarding their investment in the game. So with our spidery detour, we need to look elsewhere to progress. Moving onward, we're treated to Navi believing doors are a complicated device that needs explaining. We then encounter a new enemy type that teaches the player they can manage certain enemies with their shield. And in the following room, we have to cross a platform that collapses but we get the dungeon item, the slingshot. We're now at part 3 of the loops of the game, and by extension the designers are going to communicate how this item can be used. Our original means of getting back to the door collapsed, so we have to find a new way. What we can clearly see is a ladder hanging on the wall though, if only we had some way of getting it down. This seems too simple, but the point isn't to challenge but to teach the player the context for their newfound items' uses. It also serves to mirror a certain pest issue the player came across on their way here, and all of this is being taught to the player without a single text box. Making our way back, we can shoot down those pesky Skulltulas and safely climb up the vines. This checks off part 4 of our gameplay loop. Upon reaching the top, we can approach the ledges where these Skulltulas teach us how to use the slingshot in a combat context. This functions as part 5 of our gameplay loop, where the designer can now expand upon the use cases for the tool. You can try to swing your sword when they turn around, but the slingshot gives you a safer option. Now this next puzzle is something I will actually criticize a bit. It's a pretty simple solution, you just need to jump off the ledge and your fall will break through the web on the first floor. The problem is that at no point does the game teach you that this is a thing. There's no little challenge in the Kokiri Forest or even in the dungeon, so how is the player supposed to know the designers expect them to do this? I remember being really stuck here as a 9-year-old since I was never one to take reckless risks. To be clear, this isn't me ragging on the designers so much as I'm highlighting a breakdown in communication with the player. This is actually a moment where Navi chiming in about trying to fall through the web wouldn't be a bad idea. Ideally, we would have wanted to create some sort of minigame or basic challenge to plant this idea in the player's mind beforehand. Unfortunately, the reality of game dev doesn't always let us implement everything while meeting strict deadlines. Okay, moving on. We've fallen through the web and into the basement so we can begin the next round of tasks. After going through a gauntlet of simple challenges, we have to get rid of another web on the floor to progress. I won't criticize this one like I did with the previous floor web puzzle because you have to burn webs at least twice to reach this point. Once we drop down, we can progress to the final part of our gameplay loop for this dungeon. Bosses in general work well for this step as they present both a satisfying challenge and a climax to the dungeon's gameplay narrative. Goma may not be particularly difficult, but her function within the gameplay loop is appropriate and her defeat is a milestone that makes the player feel like they accomplished something. And with that, we've completed the intended gameplay loop all of these dungeons run on. Getting back to the story and themes, Link learns that his efforts were in vain and that the Great Deku Tree is going to die anyway. I've gotta hand it to Nintendo, making it so Link's efforts to save his father figure all for nothing is a very heavy development after the first dungeon. This decision to make everything quiet as the Great Deku Tree dies is a perfect example of how it's okay to have silent moments in a story. Instead of immediately moving on, it allows us to stop and take everything in. Silence is used again to add emotional weight to the scene when Link says goodbye to Saria. Both of these scenes do an excellent job of setting up the game's tone for future somber moments and are when the storytelling is at its strongest. You'd think this would set up the next two dungeons to have bittersweet victories, but it doesn't. Instead, helping the Gorons and the Zoras leads to victories with a lighthearted tone. I think this is an appropriate choice to help convey the sense of wonder and adventure that embodies childhood and our general feelings of nostalgia. The idea of childhood being more joyful and precious also bleeds into other aspects of gameplay, in particular the music. 4 of the songs Link acquires as a child have a relatively bright and catchy melody with very simple patterns of only 3 notes. For gameplay, it makes the songs easier for the player to remember after getting the Ocarina, but it can also be seen as how childhood perceives the world as more simple and clear-cut. The moment you gain the Ocarina of Time, however, marks a shift in the tone as well as the music. Outside of the Song of Storms, which follows the pattern of childhood songs, the adult melodies are more refined, complex, and moodier. Much like how childhood views the world more simply, adulthood understands that things are more complex than they seem, and that is reflected in these melodies. In the adult timeline, you're forced to confront how much has changed in 7 years. Hyrule has gone from an idyllic, fairy tale-esque land to one ruled by a tyrant that is actively doing harm to his subjects. Adult Link also learns about much more serious topics such as war, genocide, and how the world tries to hide some of its past ugliness. Yes, those are torture devices, and that is blood on the floor. This game was rated E on release, by the way, and in Nintendo fashion, these details are as lightly touched upon as possible since their developers don't really focus on story or implications. On the subject of storytelling, I also want to discuss the 3-act structure and how it's shaped to fit the medium of video games. Ocarina of Time is actually a great example for discussing these narrative and structure elements because it is delineated similar to a Disney movie. Just like in film, Act 1 sets up and explains the universe and establishes the hero as having some sort of flaw or desire that leaves them feeling incomplete. Ocarina of Time establishes all of this in the first 30 seconds of text. We know that Link lives in a forest with other children and is labeled an outsider because he does not have a fairy. The point of attack is an event outside the hero's control or knowledge that kicks off the plot. Some games elect to show this, while others prefer to have the player discover it as they progress. Ocarina of Time opts for the latter, with Ganondorf searching for the spiritual stones and spreading his curses off-screen. This leads to the Great Deku Tree summoning Link, which leads into our inciting incident. The inciting incident is when the conflict begins to affect the protagonist. This takes off when the Great Deku Tree informs Link of the death curse and he chooses to venture within to break it. This serves to flow into the second sequence of Act 1 and begin creating the main tension that will define Act 2. The end of Act 1 is marked by the lock-in, which is when the hero decides to embark on their quest. In Link's case, this is when he receives the Kokiri Emerald and agrees to meet with Princess Zelda. Now our story's central conflict is set up and the main tension is, will Link be able to stop Ganondorf from obtaining the Triforce? Now because Link is functionally a blank slate avatar in this game, there really isn't a want versus need conflict. A character's want in film is usually what drives the main tension that will be resolved in the second act. More narrative-driven games follow suit with their playable character's want driving the main tension, but if the game isn't story-focused, a want versus need is not always required. Oftentimes, the player's desire to keep playing functions as a satisfactory want to further drive the events of the game. Unless the game is setting out to challenge the player in some way, there typically won't be a need involved. The third sequence on the beginning of Act 2 is when the plot and gameplay start to make progress and gain momentum. In countless games, this is the point where the character leaves their hometown or some sort of safe, often tutorial-heavy area. It is also not uncommon to raise the stakes at this point. Zelda telling Link about her prophetic dream and how Ganondorf is seeking world domination with the Triforce is an example of this. The midpoint, or first culmination, marks some sort of disruption in the hero's quest. Link touches the Master Sword only to wake up 7 years later and learn Ganondorf has become the King of Evil. This ups the tension of the central conflict while also changing the aim of the quest. Many game narratives use the midpoint as a means to give the player a new set of objectives in a way that feels organic. Sequence 5 builds upon the development from the midpoint. Our main tension has shifted from preventing Ganondorf from getting the Triforce to undoing the damage his tyranny has caused. This is necessary in order for the events of the adult timeline to not feel like a complete rehash of what transpired as a child. The game also establishes the core subplot of questioning where Princess Zelda might be. While bare bones by modern video game storytelling standards, this subplot is important for planting a payoff that will happen later. It also helps to maintain Zelda's presence in the story so that when she does reappear, it feels organic instead of random. The sixth sequence brings us to the resolution of the main tension, which is typically the hero's biggest challenge yet. This often goes hand in hand with their hero being at their lowest point, which leads to major character growth. Ocarina of Time's main culmination is when Sheik reveals himself to be Princess Zelda, only to be captured by Ganondorf and forcing Link to storm his castle. Because this is a game, the bare minimum these plot points need to do is set up the excitement and anticipation for the final gauntlet of trials the player must overcome. The beginning of Act 3 starts with the protagonist making their decision that will create this act's tension. This new tension is related to the main tension, but it's always different in some way. For this story, it's no longer to stop Ganondorf because Link is the hero of prophecy, but in order to save his childhood friend Zelda. As this sequence progresses, we will often see what's called the twist in the third act. This plot point is for making the tension more interesting. In games, it's typically a beat like realizing the villain isn't dead yet in order to keep up the momentum of gameplay. Ganondorf bursting from the ruins of his castle and using the Triforce of Power to transform into Ganon is this, followed by the additional twist of Ganon knocking the Master Sword away from Link, creating the tension for how Link will defeat Ganon without it. Note that the twist in the third act does not always have to be an actual plot twist. It simply needs to help narrow or shift the focus of the tension. This leads into the climax, which is the final tension being resolved. Often this is marked by significant character growth with our hero understanding what they needed all along. Since Link isn't much of a character in this game, the climax is just defeating Ganon. While it may not be the most satisfying from a storytelling perspective, it works as a player overcoming the final challenge. Do keep in mind that the 3-act structure is not a template for a successful story. It is used to learn what creates tension and conflict while also maintaining it, and while Ocarina of Time's narrative is incredibly basic, we can use the 3-act structure to understand why it still works in a vein similar to fairy tales. The game has nowhere near the story depth or characterization of modern games or even some of its 90s contemporaries, but the execution is how it has endured. The cultural endurance of stories such as fairy tales and the desire to retell them speaks to how we as humans want to keep certain ideas that we can relate to alive in our culture. Because these stories are often so simple, it allows us to maintain aspects of the original idea while letting us mold new circumstances around it. What makes some of these stories truly timeless is their ability to speak to universal experiences that transcend cultural boundaries. While I can't say that Ocarina of Time has passed as many cultural boundaries the way Disney movies have, the core of its story does speak to a universal human experience. The gameplay may be a bit clunky and dated, but it's clearly built on a solid foundation to deliver an enjoyable experience even 20 years later. So is this game still a masterpiece? Honestly, I don't think that's the question we should be asking, nor is it the argument to be making. Much like the game's central theme, time changes everything, including our perception of Ocarina of Time itself. It was absolutely a trailblazer back in the 90s, but after 2 decades of improving technology and iterating upon its formula, it feels rather sparse and simplistic compared to modern games. So I'm very doubtful anyone new picking it up today will be floored like the world was back in 1998. Instead, I think a more productive discussion, especially for budding game devs, is what we can still learn from Ocarina of Time to make a successful game. Like I said earlier, the game itself may be dated, but the ideas and foundation are still very solid and applicable for modern games. And because many of these ideas are so simple and borderline archetypical like actual legends and fairy tales, it gives us a lot of room to experiment with new ideas. I'd be lying if I said Ocarina of Time didn't heavily influence the kind of game I want to make in the future. Just like Link does in Ocarina of Time, we grew up and began to view the world differently. Time changes everything, including our relationship with childhood memories we consider precious. But that doesn't mean we have to immediately default to cynicism just because it's easier and makes us less vulnerable. The flaws in the things we love may be more apparent now, but I think it allows us to develop a healthier, holistic love for those things, warts and all. After all of this, some of you may be shocked to hear that Ocarina of Time isn't even my favorite Zelda game. Even so, I still stand by what I said about loving the game holistically. Even if it has noticeably aged and is far from perfect in my opinion, there are still many excellent ideas here that have inspired me, and hopefully some of you watching who are also creatives feel the same way. With all of that said, if you haven't played Ocarina of Time, you should give it a try. If you find the original N64 version unpalatable, maybe the quality of life changes in the 3DS remake will make it more accessible for you. If you enjoyed this type of video, please leave a like, comment, or subscribe. I'm also considering doing a video on Majora's Mask next. Thank you for watching, and I hope you found this video insightful.